The room fell quiet in a way that did not feel rehearsed or polite, but heavy, as though the air itself had chosen to listen. It was not the kind of silence that followed applause or awaited instruction. It was deeper than that. A living pause. Cameras were already rolling, small red lights glowing like watchful eyes, suspended from cranes and studio rigs. The audience sat frozen beneath soft, theatrical lighting. Even the low electrical hum of the stage seemed to retreat, as if the space itself sensed something unscripted pressing forward. Keanu Reeves stood near the center of the stage, hands loosely folded, posture relaxed but rooted, the way someone stands when they are not trying to command attention yet somehow hold it. His expression was calm, but his eyes were awake, attuned to the subtle shift moving through the room. Across from him, Alexandra Grant drew in a slow, deliberate breath. Not the kind one takes before answering a question, but the kind taken before telling a truth that cannot be reshaped once it leaves the body. This had been scheduled as a simple live conversation about creativity, compassion, and partnership. Another polished segment meant to inspire, framed neatly between commercial breaks. But something had moved beneath the surface long before the cameras turned on. For weeks, online commentary had grown louder, sharper, uglier. Anonymous posts questioned Alexandra's presence, her relevance, her right to stand beside someone so universally admired. Some comments hid behind sarcasm and false concern. Others were blunt, cruel, confident in their dismissal. She had seen them. She had felt their weight settle in places no headline ever touched. And while Keanu had always responded to noise with quiet, Alexandra had learned through years of being underestimated that silence could either protect or suffocate. Tonight, she had chosen not to let it do the latter. The host opened the segment with practiced warmth, voice bright, posture inviting, framing the evening as a celebration of art and empathy. Applause followed, controlled and courteous. Keanu inclined his head once, offering a small, respectful smile. Alexandra listened, hands resting calmly in her lap, but her eyes carried something deeper than anticipation. They carried resolve. When the host finally turned toward her and asked what kindness meant to her in a world so quick to judge, she did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked at Keanu, not for permission, for acknowledgement. He met her gaze and gave the smallest nod, nearly imperceptible, yet full of trust. It was not encouragement, it was recognition. A silent affirmation that whatever she was about to say, he would not step in front of it. What Alexandra said next did not begin with anger. It began with truth. She spoke of moments in her life when she had been spoken over, reduced to a narrative instead of a person. She spoke of how success does not dissolve insecurity, how admiration does not shield anyone from private doubt. Her voice was steady, unhurried, yet every word landed with intent. She spoke about how kindness is often mistaken for weakness, how humility is misread as lack of worth, how society feels entitled to evaluate what it has never taken the time to understand. As she spoke, murmurs moved through the audience, not disagreement, but recognition. The kind that tightens the chest before it frees the breath. Keanu remained still. He did not interrupt, he did not redirect, he did not reach for the moment. His stillness was deliberate, a quiet act of respect. In an industry built on performance, his restraint was striking. The cameras caught it. His expression was attentive, grounded, unwavering. To anyone watching closely, it was clear he understood that this was not his story to speak, but one he was committed to standing beside. Alexandra continued, speaking of resilience not as something heroic, but as something practiced in small, unseen ways. She spoke about how public narratives erase nuance, how people forget that behind every image is a human being navigating the same doubts and hopes as anyone else. The room transformed. What had been a studio became something closer to a sanctuary. Audience members leaned forward without realizing it. Even the crew behind the glass walls stood motionless, headsets untouched. This was not entertainment, this was presence. Behind the scenes, producers exchanged uneasy glances. This was not in the rundown. This was not safe. Vulnerability was unpredictable. Real moments carried consequences, but they also carried meaning. When Alexandra paused, emotion briefly tightening her throat, Keanu shifted, not to take control, but to close the physical distance between them. He still did not speak. He simply stood there, offering a steadiness that required no performance. The audience noticed. Later, the internet would replay that moment endlessly. But in the room, it was simply a man choosing to listen when it would have been easier to speak. When Alexandra finished, applause rose slowly, then fully. People stood not because they were prompted, but because something in them had been moved. Keanu spoke only briefly. He thanked her for her courage, for her clarity, for reminding everyone that listening itself was an act of love. Then the lights dimmed. The segment ended, but what had begun was only starting. The morning after the broadcast arrived quietly, sunlight sliding through the curtains as if nothing had happened. Yet the stillness did not last. Alexandra's phone vibrated again and again on the bedside table. She did not open it immediately. She had learned that the first moments of a day should belong to intention, not reaction. Keanu was already awake, seated at the small kitchen table, coffee cooling in his hands, eyes fixed on a street that would soon fill with noise. He had not slept much. Not from regret, but from awareness. He knew what followed truth once it left the safety of a room. By mid-morning, the narratives had taken shape. Praise, criticism, reduction, distortion. Some called Alexandra brave, others called her strategic. Some thanked her. Others questioned her right to speak. Comment sections turned into battlegrounds. What unsettled her most was not the cruelty, but how quickly empathy became conditional. She thought of younger voices watching, wondering if speaking was worth the cost. An email arrived, framed politely, requesting she clarify her remarks in a more neutral setting. The language was careful. The meaning was not. Soften, reassure, retreat. Alexandra read it twice, then declined with calm firmness. Her words were not an attack. They were an invitation, and invitations did not need to be diluted. That afternoon, Keanu drove alone to a small coastal cafe he had visited for years. It was there, seated near the window with untouched tea, that someone unexpected walked in. Sandra Bullock had not planned to see him. She had been in town quietly, avoiding publicity, meeting a friend nearby. But when she recognized him through the glass, she paused. Their history was long, layered with warmth, distance, and mutual respect. She stepped inside. When he looked up, surprise softened into recognition. They did not speak at first. They did not need to. Sandra had watched the broadcast. She had seen Alexandra speak. She had seen Keanu stand still, and in that stillness she had recognized something she knew well, the cost of being visible without armor. After a moment, Sandra said quietly, "That took courage." Keanu nodded. It took honesty. They spoke not of headlines, but of pressure, of how the world rewards charm more than character, of how women especially are asked to translate their truths into something easier to digest. Sandra spoke of rooms she had walked into where silence was the expected price of belonging, of times she had paid it, of times she wished she hadn't. "People think kindness is soft," she said, "but it's one of the hardest things to protect." Keanu listened, the same way he always did, and Sandra saw then that what had happened on that stage was not a moment, it was a turning. When they parted, Sandra placed a hand briefly on his arm. "If this turns heavier," she said, "don't carry it alone." As Keanu watched her walk back into the afternoon light, he understood something with new clarity. What Alexandra had spoken had already begun to ripple. It had reached places beyond that studio, beyond intention, beyond control. And somewhere between the headlines forming and the stories waiting to surface, a larger journey was beginning. One that would test not only what people said, but what they were willing to change. The shift did not happen all at once. It crept in quietly, almost politely, disguised as routine. Invitations that once arrived freely began to carry conditions. Conversations that had once felt open now came wrapped in careful language. Alexandra noticed at first not in rejection, but in tone. Emails that praised her clarity subtly suggested restraint. Meetings that celebrated dialogue gently redirected it. It was not hostility, it was management. The kind designed to preserve comfort rather than truth. And comfort, she had learned, was often more invested in appearances than in people. The world outside their home moved as if nothing had changed, yet inside everything had. Alexandra's days filled with messages from strangers who saw themselves in her words, who wrote about classrooms where they had been ignored, workplaces where they had learned to make themselves smaller, families where silence had been the cost of peace. Each message carried its own quiet weight. They were not asking her to fix anything. They were thanking her for naming something they had never been given language for. And in that gratitude lived a responsibility she had not sought, but could not dismiss. Keanu watched this unfolding with a steadiness that did not come from detachment but from discipline. He had lived long enough under public scrutiny to recognize patterns, how quickly vulnerability could be recast as weakness, how easily nuance could be flattened into narrative. He did not rush to issue statements or counter commentary. Instead, he paid attention to Alexandra's energy, to when she grew quieter, to when the emotional labor of visibility began to weigh heavier than the criticism itself. He understood something many mistook, that being strong did not mean being untouched. Sandra remained in quiet contact. Their meeting at the cafe had reopened a channel neither of them had known they needed. She called not as a public ally, but as someone who understood the terrain. She had walked it. She had felt the cost of being misunderstood while being highly visible. She listened as Alexandra described the strange duality of the moment, being celebrated and constrained at the same time. Sandra did not offer strategy. She offered recognition. She spoke of seasons in her own life when the world wanted gratitude without honesty, when kindness had been welcomed only if it stayed harmless. "The moment your truth asks something of people," she said once, "they start calling it complicated." That word lingered with Alexandra long after the call ended. The invitation that marked the next turning point arrived on a muted afternoon, its subject line formal, its tone generous, its implications unmistakable. A prestigious cultural foundation requested Alexandra's presence at a nationally broadcast forum on public discourse and responsibility. The framing suggested balance. The subtext suggested containment. The purpose was not to deepen conversation, but to settle it. To restore an image of equilibrium without disturbing the structure beneath. Alexandra read it slowly, twice. She did not feel fear. She felt clarity. Declining would allow others to shape the narrative in her absence. Accepting meant walking into a space not designed for her comfort. She chose visibility over ease. Preparation did not look like rehearsal. It looked like reflection. Alexandra revisited the reasons she had spoken in the first place, not to defend herself, but to remind herself what was not negotiable. Dignity, honesty, the refusal to translate lived experience into something more convenient. Keanu watched this process quietly, knowing that real courage rarely announces itself. It gathers, it steadies, it chooses. Sandra insisted on meeting them the night before the forum. Not for publicity, not for planning, for grounding. They met in a small, private space away from the industry's pulse, where conversation could unfold without performance. Sandra spoke candidly about the machinery of public dialogue, about how institutions often invited voices only to neutralize them, about how easily intention could be diluted once placed under polite scrutiny. She did not caution Alexandra against speaking. She reminded her of the cost of not doing so. "They don't fear anger," she said. "They fear clarity." Keanu listened, aware that this moment marked a subtle shift. This was no longer a story about support. It was about alignment. The forum unfolded exactly as Alexandra had anticipated. The stage was immaculate. The language was refined. The questions pre-proved. The audience curated. Praise came first, warm and distancing. Then came concern framed as civility. Words like tone and impact repeated with careful precision, each implying that the problem lay not in the behavior she had named, but in the naming itself. Alexandra listened fully. When she responded, she did not sharpen her voice. She grounded it. She spoke of accountability not as accusation, but as participation. She spoke of discomfort not as damage, but as the beginning of growth. She refused the premise that politeness should outrank truth. Then the room tightened. A panelist, emboldened by institutional confidence, questioned her credibility, suggesting her experience carried weight only because of proximity rather than merit. The implication moved through the audience like a cold current. Cameras cut briefly to Keanu. He did not move. He understood the trap. Intervention would shift the moment from prejudice to protection. Alexandra did not defend her resume. She dismantled the assumption. She spoke about how systems often define worth through access, then use that same access to dismiss voices that disrupt comfort. She acknowledged privilege without apology, naming responsibility as its proper companion. Her words were calm. They were direct. They left no room for dismissal without exposure. The reaction was immediate and divided. Applause rose from some corners, stillness held in others. Online, the broadcast ignited, clips circulated in fragments and in full. The institution's attempt at containment had become amplification, and with it came something new. Former collaborators, artists, educators, individuals who had once remained silent began speaking publicly about their own experiences of being softened, redirected, managed. A pattern emerged too consistent to ignore. Sandra watched the forum from her home, the screen's glow reflecting in a quiet room. She did not react outwardly, but she felt the familiar recognition of a line crossed, not dramatically but irreversibly. She called Keanu afterward, not to discuss reactions, to ask how Alexandra was. That question, she knew, mattered more than the headlines. The days that followed carried both weight and momentum. Institutions issued statements praising dialogue, but something beneath them had already shifted. Younger artists organized, educators convened, An open letter emerged, not accusatory but aspirational, outlining principles of respect, inclusion, and shared accountability. It cited Alexandra's words not as a rallying cry but as a mirror. Signatures multiplied, disciplines overlapped. The letter moved not because it was loud, but because it was recognizable. Alexandra felt the toll of visibility settle into her body in quiet ways. Fatigue that sleep did not fully resolve, a vigilance she had to consciously release. And yet beneath it something steadier had formed, alignment. Her public voice now matched her private convictions without distortion. That alignment did not remove fear, it reorganized it. Keanu remained constant. He attended events without announcement, sat in audiences without expectation. His presence was not performative, it was relational, people noticed. In an industry fluent in symbolic gestures, consistency stood out. Sandra's involvement deepened not through statements but through participation. She reached out to some of the younger voices organizing behind the scenes, offering resources, connections, quiet encouragement. She did not place herself at the center. She reinforced the edges. She knew change rarely required a spotlight, it required endurance. One evening, weeks after the forum, the three of them sat together in a quiet home space, the city outside breathing its ordinary rhythms. No cameras, no agendas. Alexandra spoke about the messages she continued to receive. Sandra spoke about how many of them echoed her own past. Keanu listened to both, aware that something larger than any of them was unfolding. What had begun as a moment of honesty had become a movement of recognition. And movements, he knew, are never gentle on the structures that depend on silence. The storm had not passed. It had only found its direction. The weeks that followed no longer felt like reaction. They felt like reconfiguration. The public conversation that had once flared in sharp bursts began to settle into something denser, less dramatic, and more consequential. Alexandra noticed it in the nature of the invitations arriving now. They no longer asked her to clarify or soften. They asked her to contribute. Committees requested her perspective on language and inclusion. Educational spaces invited her to speak not about controversy, but about cultivating respect without erasing complexity. What had begun as resistance was quietly becoming engagement, not because outrage had succeeded, but because persistence had altered the terrain. The institutional review announced earlier, once dismissed by critics as symbolic, moved forward with unexpected seriousness. Alexandra was asked to participate not as a figurehead, but as an advisor shaping principles for public discourse. She accepted with deliberate intention. She understood that the work beyond the moment was less visible and far more demanding. It required patience, listening, the willingness to sit in rooms where progress unfolded in inches rather than declarations. She entered those spaces without illusion, aware that systems rarely transform because of a single voice, but often begin to shift when that voice refuses to disappear. Sandra became more present in this quieter phase, not as a spokesperson but as a collaborator. She attended sessions when invited, shared her own experiences of navigating influence and invisibility, and lent weight to conversations that might otherwise have been easily deferred. Her presence was grounding rather than commanding. People listened differently when she spoke, not because she dominated, but because she named contradictions many had learned to tolerate. She spoke about how narratives of success often concealed patterns of exclusion, how the language of professionalism could mask discomfort with difference. She did not indict, she illuminated, and in doing so, she widened the space Alexandra had opened. Keanu continued to move through this evolving landscape without spectacle. He did not suddenly become vocal. He did not issue manifestos. He showed up. At community discussions, at small gatherings, at events with no press releases attached. His support was not defined by proximity to the center, but by consistency at the margins. People who worked alongside him remarked on the quiet way he redirected conversations back to Alexandra when attention drifted, how he ensured her voice was not recast as extension of his. In rooms accustomed to hierarchy, that choice was quietly disruptive. Most profound changes, however, were unfolding far from institutions. Alexandra felt them in the letters that arrived now carrying not gratitude, but testimony. Teachers wrote of classrooms restructured to allow students to speak from lived experience rather than curated answers. Managers described rethinking evaluation frameworks that rewarded sameness under the guise of objectivity. Artists spoke of creating work without preemptively translating themselves into something more digestible. Each story was modest. Together they formed a living archive of impact. Alexandra read them slowly, aware that this was the work that would never trend, and yet it was the work that endured. With impact came fatigue. There were mornings when the accumulation of responsibility felt heavier than the criticism ever had, when the emotional labor of visibility pressed against the need for privacy. On those days, Alexandra withdrew deliberately, returning to the practices that had grounded her long before public attention. Long walks, unstructured writing, conversations not designed to go anywhere. Keanu understood these rhythms intuitively. He did not ask for updates, he made space. Sandra, too, recognized the signs. She sent messages that carried no agenda, just presence, just continuity. The turning point that defined this phase did not arrive through confrontation, but through commitment. A coalition of educational and cultural organizations announced a joint initiative focused on developing long-term guidelines for equitable discourse, mentorship structures, and accountability practices. Alexandra was invited to co-lead the advisory framework. The scope was larger than anything she had anticipated. It was not performative, it was structural. The work would be slow, iterative, often invisible. She accepted without hesitation, understanding that this was the bridge between conversation and change. Meetings multiplied, drafts circulated, language was examined with care. The process was rarely smooth. There were disagreements. There were moments when old habits resurfaced, when comfort attempted to reassert itself as reason. Alexandra learned to navigate these tensions without retreating or hardening. She spoke when necessary. She listened when useful. She named patterns without personalizing them. In this work, Sandra's experience proved invaluable. She understood how to negotiate institutional resistance without becoming absorbed by it. She modeled how to hold authority without replicating the structures being questioned. Their partnership deepened not through public alignment, but through shared labor. Keanu remained an anchor. In spaces where the conversation grew dense, he provided something rarer than advice. He provided steadiness. He reminded Alexandra, often without words, that the worth of this work did not depend on outcomes that could be measured quickly. He recognized when she needed affirmation and when she needed quiet. He was careful not to let his presence eclipse hers, even when others attempted to shift attention toward him. This, too, was part of the work. As months passed, early outcomes began to surface. Pilot programs launched. Mentorship networks formed, review boards diversified. None of it made headlines, but it changed rooms. People reported meetings that felt different, decision processes that included voices once absent, creative collaborations that began from mutual curiosity rather than guarded negotiation. The changes were incomplete, sometimes uneven, but they were real. The public story, meanwhile, faded from prominence. New controversies rose, new narratives displaced the old. Alexandra felt relief in this quieting. Impact, she had learned, was not diminished by reduced visibility. It was often strengthened by it. Without constant commentary, the work could breathe. It could mature. It could fail and be revised without spectacle. One evening, after a long session reviewing proposals, Alexandra, Keanu, and Sandra gathered in a private space that had become familiar to them. The conversation was unstructured. They spoke about small victories, about frustrations, about the strange intimacy of shared purpose. Sandra reflected on how rarely public moments were allowed to evolve into private commitment. Keanu spoke quietly about how stillness had been misinterpreted his entire life, and how differently it felt now when stillness had become an act rather than an absence. Alexandra listened, aware that what they were building was not a movement in the traditional sense. It was a practice. A practice of listening when speaking would be easier, of naming when ignoring would be more comfortable, of remaining when withdrawing would be simpler. And practices, unlike moments, do not conclude. They continue. The world had not been reshaped, but it had been interrupted. And in that interruption, something new had begun to take form. The public quiet that followed the earlier surge of attention created the illusion of calm, but beneath it the work had not slowed. If anything, it had intensified. Alexandra's days became shaped less by appearances and more by participation, long sessions reviewing frameworks, careful discussions about language, quiet consultations that unfolded far from any stage. The transformation she had helped initiate was no longer abstract. It had entered policies, classrooms, creative spaces, and organizational culture. Yet the deeper the work went, the more it touched places no institution could mediate. It touched identity. It touched belonging. It touched the long, often unspoken negotiations people make between visibility and survival. With that shift came a different kind of resistance, Not the loud criticism of early weeks, but the subtler unease of those who felt change encroaching on familiar ground. Invitations still arrived, but some now came wrapped in strategic hesitation. Partnerships paused, projects stalled without explanation. Support that had once been generous became conditional. Alexandra recognized the pattern. This was not backlash meant to intimidate. It was the recalibration of access. The quiet reminder of how much opportunity remained tethered to compliance. She did not speak of this publicly. She carried it privately in the small ways disappointment settles into the body. Keanu noticed. He had learned the difference between exhaustion and erosion. One evening, after returning from separate commitments, he found Alexandra sitting in the dimness of their living space, lights off, not distressed but distant. When he asked how she was, she did not answer immediately. When she did, she spoke not of work but of weight. Of the strange grief that comes with growth, when progress costs you rooms you once belonged to, when the future begins to ask for versions of yourself that cannot coexist with the past. Keanu did not try to resolve it. He sat beside her, the way he always did, not closing space with solutions but with presence. He spoke quietly about moments in his own life when choosing integrity had altered the geography of belonging, when people he admired had grown unfamiliar, when doors had not closed dramatically but simply stopped opening. He did not frame it as sacrifice. He framed it as sorting. The world, he said, reveals itself not in who applauds your values, but in who can live alongside them. Alexandra felt something in her chest loosen at that, not because the cost disappeared, but because it was no longer solitary. Sandra's life, too, was shifting in quieter ways. Her increased involvement in the advisory work brought her back into spaces she had once deliberately stepped away from. She encountered familiar dynamics, new language layered over old patterns, progress intertwined with reluctance. Yet she also witnessed something she had not expected. Younger participants, emboldened by Alexandra's steadiness, spoke with a clarity that did not seek permission. They challenged frameworks respectfully. They asked better questions. They brought experiences once relegated to margins into the center of discussion. Sandra recognized in them a version of herself she had rarely been allowed to be. The recognition was not nostalgic. It was instructive. It reminded her that influence carried a responsibility beyond survival. It carried a duty to widen the path. The personal cost became undeniable the night Alexandra received word that a long-anticipated collaboration had been quietly withdrawn. No explanation, no conflict, just absence. The project had mattered to her, not for visibility, but for the ideas it promised to explore. The loss landed heavier than expected. It was not the first door to close, but it was the one she had believed immune to this season of her life. She read the message more than once, each time feeling the subtle recalibration of her creative future. She did not cry. She did not call anyone. She sat with it, allowing herself to acknowledge disappointment without transforming it into self-doubt. When she eventually spoke about it, it was not with anger but with a kind of quiet mourning. Sandra listened carefully, recognizing the familiar ache of projects that vanish without language. She spoke of how easily industries celebrated courage in theory while disciplining it in practice. She reminded Alexandra that grief was not proof of mistake. It was evidence of investment. Keanu added little, but what he did say mattered. He told her that loss did not always mean the wrong path. Often it meant the narrowing of it. And narrowing, he said, though it felt like subtraction, was frequently a refinement. It was around this time that Alexandra began to feel the emotional weight of the countless stories entrusted to her. The letters continued. The testimonies multiplied. With them came an unspoken expectation that she would respond, that she would carry, that she would represent. She had never sought that role. She did not resent it, but she felt its gravity. The work had expanded beyond dialogue into responsibility. And responsibility, she knew, could easily eclipse the self if left unexamined. One afternoon, after a particularly heavy meeting, Alexandra chose not to return home immediately. She walked instead through a quiet public garden near the city's edge, a place she had once visited without recognition, without context. She sat alone on a bench and watched the slow choreography of ordinary life, people walking dogs, a child tracing patterns in dirt, an elderly couple sharing a thermos. The simplicity steadied her. It reminded her that impact was not only measured in initiatives or letters. It lived also in presence, in continuity, in the permission to exist beyond function. That evening, she spoke to Keanu and Sandra about something she had been circling inwardly for weeks. She told them she needed to recalibrate, not to withdraw, but to redefine how she engaged. She did not want to become a conduit through which all this work flowed. She wanted it to become a shared architecture. She spoke of creating a foundation not centered on her voice, but on collective stewardship, a space where the labor of change did not depend on singular visibility. Sandra responded immediately. This was what sustainability looked like. This was how movements survived the people who initiated them. Keanu supported the decision without hesitation. He understood that the most ethical leadership was often the kind that designed itself to be unnecessary. The following months were devoted to building this new structure. Alexandra worked with advisors, educators, artists, and community organizers to outline a framework that distributed agency rather than concentrating it. Sandra offered connections, insight, and experience, helping navigate the inevitable complexities of formalizing something that had grown organically. Keanu remained on the periphery of the process, visible enough to support, distant enough to protect its independence. Together, they were not creating an organization. They were cultivating a method. As the foundation took shape, Alexandra felt a shift within herself. The work no longer lived entirely in her chest. It began to breathe beyond her. That release did not diminish her involvement. It deepened it. She was no longer only responding, she was constructing. Yet even as progress unfolded, the personal reckoning continued. She was learning to let go of identities that had once felt stable, to accept that not every relationship survived clarity, to grieve without retreating, to celebrate without claiming ownership. In this interior work, she discovered something quietly radical. That strength was not the absence of fracture. It was the capacity to reorganize around it. The change she had helped initiate was no longer something happening around her. It was something happening within her. And with that realization came the understanding that the final test would not come from institutions or audiences. It would come from the choices she made when no one was watching. By the time the Foundation's framework was formally announced, there was no sense of arrival, only of continuation. No press spectacle marked its beginning. No grand declaration accompanied its launch. Instead, the work unfolded the way Alexandra had always believed real change should, deliberately, collaboratively, and with more listening than language. The announcement came through shared networks, educational circles, community organizations, and creative institutions that had already been participating in the dialogue. Its purpose was not to lead conversation, but to support it. Not to become a stage, but to build rooms where others could speak without waiting to be invited. Alexandra did not stand at its center. She stood within it. This shift altered her days in ways she had not fully anticipated. The emotional burden she had been carrying began to distribute itself naturally. The letters no longer came only to her. They flowed into collective channels where educators, counselors, artists, and advocates responded. Conversations that had once depended on her presence now continued without it. At first, this unsettled her. Visibility had become so closely linked with responsibility that stepping back felt like abandonment. But over time, she recognized something quieter and far more sustaining. The work was no longer borrowing her voice. It was finding its own. Sandra found herself deeply engaged in this evolution. She mentored younger collaborators, supported structural development, and quietly underwrote programs that would never carry her name. The work reawakened something in her that she had not realized had gone dormant, not ambition, but authorship. She was no longer responding to industry narratives. She was participating in shaping environments. The difference, she often reflected, was the difference between surviving a system and contributing to one's own. Through this process, she and Alexandra formed a bond that transcended circumstance. It was not based on similarity. It was based on recognition. They saw in each other the courage it took to remain open in spaces that rewarded closure. Keanu's presence continued to operate as a constant, not as an intervention, but as a climate. Those who worked within the Foundation remarked on the steadiness he brought into rooms simply by entering them. He did not steer discussions. He rarely spoke unless asked. Yet his attention altered the tone. Conversations slowed. People listened more carefully. The absence of hierarchy made honesty easier. He understood that leadership was not always directional. Sometimes it was atmospheric. It made certain behaviors possible simply by refusing to reward others. As the Foundation's programs expanded, early outcomes emerged quietly. Schools integrated new discourse frameworks. Creative institutions adopted mentorship models that paired access with accountability. Workplaces piloted listening practices that valued lived experience alongside credentials. None of it felt dramatic. All of it felt different. Alexandra visited several of these spaces not as a keynote presence, but as a participant. She sat in classrooms where students spoke about identity without translating themselves. She listened in meeting rooms where decisions were discussed without pretense. She witnessed moments where someone's words, once deferred, now anchored a conversation. These encounters moved her more deeply than any recognition ever could. They were not about her, and that was precisely what made them meaningful. With the external work finding rhythm, Alexandra's internal landscape began to soften. The vigilance she had carried since that first night on stage loosened. She allowed herself to return to projects that had nothing to do with dialogue or advocacy. She created without commentary. She spent time in spaces that did not require interpretation. She rediscovered pleasure in anonymity, in movement, in art unburdened by expectation. This return to self did not pull her away from the work. It strengthened her within it. She was no longer sustained by reaction. She was sustained by alignment. Sandra noticed the change. She commented once, half smiling, that Alexandra's laughter sounded different now, less careful, more full. Alexandra understood what she meant. The work had asked much of her, but it had also returned something essential: permission to exist beyond her impact. One evening, months into this quieter chapter, the three of them gathered in a familiar private space. There was no agenda. They shared a meal, spoke of ordinary things, of films and books and distant travel ideas. At some point, the conversation returned naturally to what had begun it all, not with analysis, but with reflection. Sandra spoke of how rarely people were allowed to evolve publicly without being fixed into a single narrative. Keanu spoke about how stillness, once mistaken for absence, had become his most intentional offering. Alexandra listened, aware that the arc they had walked together was not one of escalation, but of redistribution. Power had moved outward, voice had multiplied, responsibility had become shared. Later that night, after Sandra had gone, Alexandra and Keanu sat together in the quiet. The city beyond the windows moved in its familiar patterns. Alexandra spoke softly about something she had not yet articulated, that she no longer felt defined by the moment that had started everything. She felt shaped by what followed, by the conversations she had not controlled, by the spaces she had not occupied, by the people who no longer needed her to speak in order to speak themselves. Keanu responded simply, as he often did. He said that this was how truth lasted, not by staying visible but by becoming usable. In the weeks that followed, the Foundation released its first collective report, not as an accomplishment but as an invitation. It outlined learnings rather than directives, questions rather than conclusions. It named areas of growth alongside areas of resistance. It refused the illusion of completion. The response was thoughtful. Some praised it, some challenged it. Alexandra welcomed both. She had learned that agreement was not the measure of progress. Engagement was. One message arrived that stayed with her. It was from a young teacher who wrote about a student who had spoken openly for the first time in a class discussion, sharing an experience she had never voiced. The teacher did not frame it as breakthrough. She framed it as relief. The student had said simply, "I didn't think anyone wanted to hear this." Alexandra read the line again and again. It contained everything. The world had not become gentle, but it had become more capable of listening. And listening, she understood now, was not passive. It was an act of participation. The quiet choices she and others were making every day were not dramatic, but they were durable. They were shaping something that would outlast any moment. A way of being with one another that did not depend on stages. A way of honoring voice without turning it into spectacle. A way of standing still not out of hesitation, but out of respect. And in that stillness, something enduring was taking form. The final shape of what Alexandra had helped begin did not arrive with ceremony. It emerged slowly, almost imperceptibly, in the way language shifted within rooms, in the way people paused before speaking, in the way questions were asked without the quiet intention to diminish. Months after the Foundation's work had moved into its second phase, Alexandra found herself less often invited to speak and more often invited to listen. This, she realized, was not absence. It was evidence. The work was no longer orbiting her voice. It was unfolding through many. She experienced this one morning while attending a gathering she had not been asked to lead. The room was filled with educators, artists, community organizers, and students, individuals from different backgrounds, disciplines, and generations. They were not there to reference the moment that had once placed her in the public eye. They were there to discuss practices they had developed themselves, listening structures, mentorship networks, accountability circles. Alexandra sat among them without introduction. No one turned toward her for answers, and in that unremarkable anonymity she felt something deeply remarkable. The future was speaking in its own language. Sandra attended such gatherings as well, often without notice. She had found in this quieter phase a different kind of fulfillment than any recognition she had known. The work did not celebrate her, it required her. And in being required, she rediscovered the part of herself that had once believed creation was not performance but participation. She contributed where she was useful. She withdrew where she was not. Younger collaborators sought her counsel not as a symbol, but as a practitioner. She offered stories rather than conclusions. She modeled something she had learned the long way. That influence endures when it teaches others how to hold it. Keanu's role, if it could be called that, remained what it had always been. He was present. He moved alongside rather than ahead. He attended events without being announced. He supported projects without imprinting them. In spaces where hierarchy once defined conversation, his manner quietly unsettled expectation. He did not occupy authority. He redistributed attention. When others attempted to frame him as anchor or emblem, he redirected them toward the work itself, toward the people doing it. Over time, this too became part of the culture surrounding the foundation. Presence without ownership, support without spectacle. Alexandra continued her creative work with renewed clarity. She no longer felt compelled to embed message into every project. She trusted the work she had helped seed to carry its own momentum. In returning to art for its own sake, she found that the world she engaged now received it differently. Viewers did not ask what it represented. They asked how it felt. The shift mattered. It meant that dialogue had moved from explanation to experience. And experience, she knew, was where empathy lived. One afternoon, while walking alone through a familiar neighborhood, Alexandra passed a small community center she had once visited quietly months before. Through its open doors, she heard voices engaged in animated discussion. Curious, she paused. Inside, a circle of people were gathered, sharing reflections, listening without interruption, responding without competition. The facilitator was young, nervous, steady. Alexandra recognized her. She had written months earlier, thanking Alexandra for the courage to speak. Now she was not writing, she was leading. Alexandra did not enter, she did not announce herself. She watched for a moment, then continued walking. The scene accompanied her like a private affirmation. What had once been a message had become a method. The moral arc Alexandra had never intended to author had arrived at its quiet conclusion. Not because conflict had vanished, but because capacity had grown. People were no longer waiting for permission to speak or protection to listen. They were practicing both. The justice served was not retributive, it was distributive. It had spread. One evening, long after the first stillness on that stage, Alexandra, Keanu, and Sandra gathered one last time before Sandra left for an extended period of travel she had planned without itinerary. They sat together without urgency, sharing stories not of work, but of life. At some point, the conversation returned gently to that night when everything had begun. Sandra spoke of how she had watched it unfold on a screen and felt something loosen in her that she had carried for years. Keanu spoke of how stillness, once mistaken for absence, had revealed itself as choice. Alexandra listened, aware that the meaning of that night had changed for her. It was no longer about what she had said. It was about what others had done with it. When they parted, there was no sense of conclusion, only continuity. Each moved back into their own paths, carrying what had been shaped between them not as obligation, but as orientation. The world beyond them continued as it always had, complicated, uneven, often resistant. But within it, something subtle had recalibrated. Listening had become an act. Kindness had reclaimed its strength. Respect had been redefined not as agreement, but as attention. The stillness that once filled a single room had expanded into countless others, each time someone chose not to interrupt, not to diminish, not to look away. Alexandra returned home that night and stood for a long moment at the window, watching the city's lights scatter across the dark. She thought of the countless conversations she would never hear, the ones unfolding in classrooms, kitchens, studios, meeting rooms, community centers. She did not need to witness them. Their existence was enough. She understood now that truth does not belong to the one who speaks it. It belongs to the ones who carry it forward. And sometimes, the most powerful way to change the world is not to speak again, but to stand still and let others be heard.